Rights that come from God, not government. Do you get what that really means? Do you get the idea of American exceptionalism behind that concept? Do you get the difference between rights that come from God versus rights that come from the Constitution? That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt, and I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. And before I get into that topic of discussion, I want to mention that Bold and Blunt is now available not only at WashingtonTimes.com, where you can subscribe to Bold and Blunt by signing up for my 3 times a week newsletter at WashingtonTimes.com, but it's also available wherever podcasts are offered, and especially, particularly, of a special note, at edify.app/podcasts. That's the place to go to if you are looking for podcasts with a faith-based component. Bold and Blunt is among the lineup there. Check out all the podcasts, subscribe to Bold and Blunt, either at Edify or at Washington Times or wherever podcasts are offered. And I want to give a quick thank you to those who are already part of my regular subscription base. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys. So God-given rights, that gets tossed about quite a bit. It gets tossed about by patriotic Americans. It gets tossed about by me quite a bit because the core concept of American exceptionalism, if you had to sum it up in just a simple phrase, an easy to remember phrase, is God-given rights. Rights that come from a creator, not from government. The Declaration of Independence makes this clear, that we are endowed by our creator with certain inalienable rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and that government is there to protect, preserve, maintain, defend those rights. It's a priority list. It's a phrase that makes clear that you as a human being in America are born with certain rights as put forth, as listed, as underscored in the Constitution. That you are born into those rights given freely by God, and that government is not there to give you certain rights, to give you certain privileges, to give to some, to take from others, to deny others. The government rightfully can't do that, and if you want a list of what those rights are, the Constitution makes them clear in the Bill of Rights. The Constitution makes it clear what the government, a rightful government, is allowed to do in terms of infringing on those God-given rights, which is really very little. The Constitution makes clear, along with the Declaration of Independence, along with all the writings of our founding fathers, that government bureaucrats, whether federal, state, local, what have you, never mind global, they really have very limited ability to trounce on the rights that you're granted at birth. At birth, you're granted the right to speak your mind, particularly when it comes to political matters. The right to worship freely, despite a government's order to close down your church based on some safety or medical and health concern like a virus. The right to protect yourself and family, not so much hunt, but protect yourself and family from threats to your God-given liberties with a gun, a Second Amendment right. The right to petition your government for redress of grievances, the right to assemble, to stand outside Congress, to stand outside the White House, to walk in the streets and petition the government to change how the government is doing something. These are rights that are granted by God. Yes, they're spelled out in the Constitution, but that doesn't mean it's the Constitution that grants you those freedoms. That just means, for the sake of clarity, the Founding Fathers put in the Constitution precisely what they mean by rights from the Creator. Let me read this from the Heritage Foundation, written by Ed Fulner, the founder and former president of the Heritage Foundation. The Constitution doesn't grant us freedoms. It prohibits government from taking them. Think on that. That's the concept of American exceptionalism right there. If you want to teach your children how government in America is supposed to go, teach them first and foremost, and harp on it daily, that in America our rights come from God. Because there's no other nation in the world that says that. America's different. That's what makes America different. And that is what the collectivists and the globalists and the leftists and the socialists and the communists and the Marxists and so forth and so on, and the progressives and the Democrat Party, that's what they're all fighting at root. The idea that rights come from God. They want rights to be in the hands of government to decide who gets, who doesn't get. Back to Fulner's piece. Nearly all of us at one time or another refer to our constitutional right to free speech. While this common phrase may seem harmless, it points to a larger misunderstanding of where our rights come from, a misunderstanding that undermines many of our most fundamental policy debates. Agreed. You have to be careful of the narrative because the left is very clever at taking the narrative and shaping it to advance an agenda that without deception and deceit, they wouldn't normally be able to advance. And let me give you an example of how the left is so clever about pushing the goalpost in America farther away from individual God-given liberties and toward a more collectivist approach that puts individual liberties and that concept subservient to an idea of a greater good, a collectivist good. The face mask mandates in America that more than 2 years ago I wrote in a commentary piece for the Washington Times, a headline something like "Face mask mandates are civil rights violations or civil rights offenses," for which I was mocked and derided and attacked by not just the left, but some on the more moderate side of the conservative movement or conservative political camps that were fearful of the coronavirus, right? More than 2 years ago, I wrote this piece. But look at where face mask mandates have taken us. If you don't make the case that something you put on your face that prohibits free flow of breathing, that covers up something as personal as your own face, if you don't make the case that government doesn't really have the right to do that, even based on some sort of perceived health emergency, as it was based on, then what happens is you get to the point in time, sooner or later, where government can use the justification of that health emergency to say that face masks must be worn all the time, face masks must be worn some of the time, face masks must be worn by some, while others don't have to wear face masks. Face masks must be worn in some settings, but not in all settings. They basically have the right to dictate to individual citizens where face masks must be worn versus where face masks must not be worn. And this is where we're at now. If you don't make the case that something as personal as what you put on your body, whether it's for a health emergency, deemed health emergency, which is curiously deemed by the government, the same government that is issuing the face masking orders anyhow, if you don't make the case that these things are personal medical decisions or personal individual liberties or personal God-given liberties, rights to self-determine, then you end up walking the path of government choosing who has to do this versus who doesn't. And so this is where we're at in America right now with the face mask mandates. And so we have a federal judge who just came out and declared that the CDC overreached its bounds, overreached its proper authorities by mandating that face masks had to be worn on public transportation, including airplanes. Already the government had reeled back the order, mind you, that citizens had to wear face masks in other settings. But for some reason, the government was very stubborn about releasing the mandate that face masks be worn in public transportation. So the idea, first and foremost, that government can order citizens to wear face masks over a health emergency that the government itself declared, even as science and fact and evidence and truth were showing that the justification for the health emergency had long ago passed. But just that the idea that government has the authority to order citizens to wear face masks is an egregious affront to the Constitution. That's number one. That's fact number one. But that's where we get in this country when we take rights from government, not God. But here's where it gets really sticky. The part where conservatives in particular cheered this judge's order. The idea that a federal judge has to come in, has to intervene and make clear that a bureaucracy in America does not have the right to dictate face mask wearing at this point in time on public transportation. On one hand, that's great, but on the other hand, look at this. Doesn't that just move the goalpost? Doesn't that just put a different branch of government in charge of giving us individual rights that we should already have from God? Patriotic Americans, COVID-weary Americans decried the ongoing orders to wear face masks on airplanes, say. Decried the fact that the CDC could order us into face masks, but then turned around and cheered when a federal judge released us all from those face mask mandates. But isn't that just a trade-off of one level of government or one body of government for another, telling us what rights we have as American citizens? And look, this is the slippery slope of not insisting on rights coming from God, not government. Because it always puts up as vulnerable rights that shouldn't be in the hands of government to decide at all. If you, like me, think it's a civil liberty or a God-given right to decide whether or not you have to slap a face mask on or not, and a government body comes along and takes those rights away, and then a different government body comes on and gives those rights back to you, the right to self-decide, to self-determine, that's a win on one hand, but it's not really a huge win, because it still leaves open the question of what government body is going to come along in the future and take those rights away again. What government body is going to come along in the future and put in place again another mandate, another face mask mandate? That's the difference between God-given rights and government-granted rights. God-given rights cannot be challenged by the government. The government can't come on and shut down Bold and Blunt podcasts because the government doesn't like what I'm saying, because I have the God-given right to speak my mind, to speak my opinion. Now, if I were in China, I wouldn't have that right. The government could monitor what I'm saying on Bold and Blunt and come in and break into a studio where I record Bold and Blunt and Arrest Me and so forth and so on. But that's not supposed to happen in America, because America's land of the free, right? Land of the freedoms that come from God, not government. Or are we? And this is the big question. Where are we on that concept nowadays in America? You look at all the things the government does and all the things that American citizens watch government do. Sometimes protesting, sometimes not protesting. But look at how the goalpost of God-given liberties have been moved in recent years. That's the big fight. That's what we need to keep in mind when we wage all these political and cultural battles in America. It's a God-given right that is the end game here, not just a court win, not just a political win. Because court wins, political wins, all those are just moments in time that can be changed by the next court case or by the next political campaign. And my guest today, Pete Peterson, he is the Dean of the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University. He's here today to talk about the state of conservatism in America, the state of individual liberties, the state even of God-given versus government granted. Pete, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
Great to be with you, Cheryl.
So I was looking through your bio and I saw something that struck me. Your bio is impressive, but I saw something that struck me as a good place to start our discussion today. In 2017, you helped with this initiative called American Project on the Future of Conservatism, and that was in 2017. I wonder if you can comment on, when you look around the scope of America right now, what do you see in terms of the conservative movement?
Well, I think it's fair to say that both on the left and right, we are seeing what I can only describe as a fracturing that's being precipitated by populist movements. Again, that is certainly happening on the right, but it's also happening on the left. I think both of those movements are equal and opposite responses to a broader feeling among many Americans that their governing institutions are not responsive to their needs, and in light of COVID, have become rather revealed in some cases to be either highly ideological or have become quite aggressive, certainly in the lockdowns that we've seen.
It's interesting that you say that you see these types of populist movements on both sides of the political aisle, because I go back in time to Donald Trump when he was running for president, and he said that his worst case scenario would have been to face Bernie Sanders. And I think it's probably because it touches on what you just said about the populism.
Well, that's very right, Cheryl. And in fact, when you say that, I'm reminded directly of some Pew survey data that had come out during the 2016 election cycle, just a couple months away from the eventual election, which showed that in a large percentage of voters who supported the eventual President Trump, their second choice was Bernie Sanders. And so you saw this kind of interesting, what seemed to be a crossing over of parties, but again, really was speaking to this broader reaction on the part of many voters who really wanted to see significant change in how the federal government was perceived as working or failing.
So odd that somebody who would support Donald Trump could place Bernie Sanders anywhere on that same list of supporting. And I guess to me, it's because people aren't looking at the bigger battle. And I wonder, you being affiliated with Pepperdine University, which is a faith-based school, I wonder if you could weigh in on this. To me, the biggest war in America is the fight for God-given individual rights versus collectivism. And all these other issues that play out in the political and cultural worlds are just little whack-a-mole battles. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think the rights, the way that you frame that is certainly part of the issue. I think that a series of trend lines that we saw leading to 2016 were only exacerbated and increased in COVID. Just to pull two areas that I think have many voters continuing to think differently about politics. One is education, and how our children, specifically in K-12 schools, but also in higher education, how they are learning and what they are being taught. So much of that was revealed due to COVID, and with the lockdowns, parents seeing what their kids were being taught, much to their dismay. And then the other area would be the lockdown policies, and the fact that we have seen, we saw different states reacting in different ways. And the data appears to be coming out now that there was really no major difference in the health effects between states that locked down, like here in California, and the states that didn't, like Florida. And so with that, there were obviously economic consequences. I know here in California we had hundreds, if not thousands, of small businesses had to close because of the lockdowns. You had stresses placed on families because their kids could no longer go to school. And then, of course, you had these, I hate to call them culture war issues. I think you're right to frame these more as rights. The closing of churches and issues around religious liberty. So I think the trend lines that we saw leading again to the 2016 election and these populist trends, again, were only increased in the response to COVID. And certainly the current president, President Biden, and his really extremely low approval ratings only highlights that voters across the political spectrum remain very unhappy with the direction of the country.
I worry that the outcome of the government's response to the coronavirus has forevermore changed the shape of America's liberties, of how America defines liberties. And let me give you an example just based on the recent court ruling, the recent federal judge who tossed out the CDC's mandates on face masks for public travel. Everybody in America, except those who love face masks, are cheering this ruling. And conservatives, when conservatives cheer that ruling, in one respect, I'm on board. I'm cheering as well. But on the other side, I'm also thinking, why was this even in the hands of a judge to decide? And so I see the goalposts slowly. No matter whether the left wins or loses, it seems like the left is gaining in America.
Well, I think we are seeing instances where the public is responding in very American ways. One of our faculty here, Dr. Ted McAllister, who's a historian, is coming out with a new book called An Unruly People. And there have been times in American history where the federal government in particular has been very restrictive, only to be met by populist responses that have pulled back government powers. I think even back to World War I and various speech codes and pieces of legislation that were passed. You think about the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. These are seen as dramatic government overreaches and were responded to both through the courts and through the ballot box. And when you look at what we saw in Virginia with the governor's race there, I think what you see is an instance where Americans sense that their rights are being taken away from them. They sense that government has become highly ideological and not in their best interests. And they're responding, as Americans do, through civic participation and engagement. We almost saw the same thing happen in New Jersey, which is where I come from. The thought that a governor's race would be in doubt for a Democrat is really remarkable. And I have to say as well, Cheryl, I know a lot of political pundits look at the recall election that we had here last fall, and they just look at the results and that Gavin Newsom won that recall by a landslide. But I think it would be wrong to look past the fact that the governor was even forced to stand for a recall, given that just 3 years prior he had won by one of the great landslides in California history. And so even out here in deep blue California, there are murmurings and glimmerings. I don't know if you saw the story about the recall of school board members for the San Francisco School Board.
Yep.
I mean, that is the bluest of the blue. And you saw there voters, again, understanding that even their San Francisco schools had become so ideological that they recalled 3 members of their board and replaced them with, frankly, more moderate.
You could
really
say it sane.
In their lives, more moderate voices.
Yes. And you know, when you frame it like that, when you list that, it gives me great optimism about the future of America, that liberty indeed is not dead. But then I have to remind myself that, you know, if we rely on political elections or we rely on ballot recalls, that our freedoms are only as safe as the next election. So I'm just wondering, at Pepperdine, right, and this is going back to the faith-based aspect of Pepperdine, what are you guys doing that's different from other colleges to prepare your graduates to see the landscape in America as founding fathers would envision it, and to fight for those freedoms?
Well, it begins with our unique curriculum, right? There are about 200 graduate policy programs in the country, and I would dare say the program that we have here, the curriculum, is one that balances a rigorous study of American history and political philosophy, along with the quantitative classes that one has to take to be able to evaluate public policy. One of our core classes here is titled Roots of American Order, and it's based on the Russell Kirk book, but explores the Western civilization tradition that led, really in many ways, directly in the American experience to the Constitution. And we don't just study the Constitution as a document, we study the Constitution as a process that involved, in some cases, violent debates over what the future of the new nation was going to be. If we want to talk about diversity, there was a diversity of opinions over the direction of the United States, how it was going to be organized, what the power of states was going to be versus the federal government. And so we study that, again, not to just learn history, but to understand that so many of the policy and political debates, including the judge's decision on the mask mandates, even the most modern decisions rely on a constitution that provides these recourses to everyday American citizens to hold government accountable, whether that's at the local level, the state level, or the federal level. And so to understand that all of this is contingent upon the founders' understanding of the importance of self-governance really is at the core of what we teach here. So many of these graduate policy schools think that if we just give more money to the federal government and just tweak a thing here or there, we'll be able to solve issues like poverty and homelessness and so forth. And we care deeply about those issues, but they have to be addressed. As the judge said in her decision, even for the best of intentions that the CDC may have had, they still have to abide by the Constitution in the delivery or designing of public policy.
Yep. up, and the road to hell paved with good intentions.
Yeah, that's right.
Ronald Reagan, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. There's so much wisdom in these short phrases. And just as we wrap up here, just as we talk about the last question that I wanted to ask is, when you look at America and you deal with America's youth, and when I look at America's youth, I see it through the prism of media reports, right? That's what I do all day long. And it doesn't look good. It really doesn't. So when you look at America's youth, what do you see in terms of the future of American liberties?
Well, Cheryl, it's an interesting thing. Obviously, I'm seeing a certain slice of America's youth, those that are making the decision to choose a school like Pepperdine and the Graduate Policy School. And so there's what we call in the trade selection bias, right? So
right.
I'm seeing kids that want to go on to careers in public service, and they also want to be prepared in the way that we prepare them here. That being said, I came to my own understanding of my own career in calling after 9/11. That was really a pivotal event in my own life that really transitioned me out of a private sector career into a career in public policy and academia. What I'm seeing among this generation, at least the ones I get a chance to interact with, is that COVID is having a similar impact. And to be more specific about it, where 9/11, I think, focused many people on international relations and federal policy and serving in the military and so forth, what COVID has made so many people aware of is that their local governments are often where the action is at. Right? These are where decisions are being made in school boards. These are where decisions are made in county administrative buildings, where things like lockdowns and so forth are decided upon. And so what I'm beginning to see, and I'm very hopeful about it, is that Americans, especially those interested in public service who thought, I've got to go to Capitol Hill and change the world, are now realizing that maybe I need to go to the county seat or into my local school district or to the state capitol and influence policy there. And that is at least what we're seeing here at the public policy school, is that we're seeing a generation of students that are more focused now because of COVID on the importance of local, county, and state government.
Now that is optimistic to me, because I spent years covering local news before I got into national news at the Washington Times, and people would be amazed at the decisions made at your local zoning. I mean, it's crazy. The private property rights strip, the individual liberties laws. So that's great. Very good news, and I'm so glad to have met you over Bold and Blunt. Pete Peterson with Pepperdine University. Thank you so much for your time and for the work you do shaping America's youth.
Great to be with you, Cheryl, and thanks so much.
God-given versus government granted. That, in a nutshell, is what makes America great. That's the difference of America over every other nation in the world, that we in America get our individual rights from God, and government is only there to protect and maintain. As a matter of fact, government is there to serve the citizens, to protect and maintain, in protecting and maintaining those God-given rights. That's why they're called public servants. They're there to protect our God-given liberties. Teach your children well. And don't forget, you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app/podcast. You can get Bold and Blunt anywhere podcasts are offered, or of course at washingtontimes.com. And I have a new book coming out that actually will help teach your children about God-given rights. It's called Lockdown, the Socialist Plan to Take Away Your Freedom. And it's all the various ways not only government used, but also will continue to use the coronavirus to steal your God-given liberties and bring about this new world order of global collectivist government. It's on the horizon. It's taking place. Pick up a copy of Lockdown and teach your children well. Like I said, thank you for listening. Tune in next time. And in the meanwhile, stay blunt, stay bold.